to. Hi. So before I start, I'm going to tell you how this book came about, but I'll tell you a little story. One of the things that all of these women had in common was that they were all incredibly good communicators. And I was at a book festival in LA with a couple of other biographers, and we were talking about stories that didn't make it into our books that ended up on the cutting room floor, because inevitably, if you're writing about someone's life, everything can't make it in. It was about Jane Goodall. Jane Goodall, as most of you know, she's 84 now, but she's on the road 300 days a year, traveling, advocating for sustainable habitats and doing good works for the world. And so she has a couple of handlers. And one morning, one of her handlers said, Jane, you're going to be, in an hour, you have to be in this room, and you're going to speak to the top brass of the LA Police Department. And she thought, oh, you know. So she got there, and there were all these policemen, all male, kind of staring down at their laps thinking, I'm sure this is so boring, why do we have to listen to this woman primatologist? So she looked around the room and she said, well, if I was a female chimpanzee, and I were to walk into a room full of alpha males, such as yourself, I would be a damn fool if I didn't begin with an act of submission, which would be to show my genitals. At which point everyone looked up and perked up. Very paying close attention. So she, I mean, and in a way, all of these women, as I'll tell you later, were really good at getting attention. Let me tell you, today I'm going to principally talk about Jane Jacobs and Rachel Carson, but I will talk a little about the others. But let me start with telling you how this book came about, because people often say, well, why were you writing about 4 women in 4 different fields who didn't know each other? I mean, what was the connective tissue? Why did you do that? And the reason is, I was having a conversation with a friend, and I realized there were 4 women, each of whom, in interestingly similar and parallel ways, had changed the way we think about the world. Rachel Carson, who at age 55 in 1962 wrote Silent Spring, completely changing the way we think about chemicals in the environment and kicking off the environmental movement. Jane Jacobs, who in 1961, a year before, saved Greenwich Village from the wrecking ball and wrote an audacious little book called The Life and Death of Great American Cities, or The Death and Life of Great American Cities, which completely changed the way we think about cities and kicked off the historic preservation movement in the long run. And changed the way we think about older cities and older buildings and older neighborhoods. Jane Goodall, who in 1960, at the age of 27, discovered chimps using tools, overnight changed the way we think about animals and kicking off the animal rights movement, and Alice Waters, who in 1965, on a semester abroad in France, fell in love with France and French cooking and kind of had an epiphany about the importance of food in community and realized that conversation starts at the table and good food was the beginning of kind of community. So she came back to Berkeley and a few years later started Chez Panisse, which was the first restaurant dedicated wholly to fresh, local, organic food. And she gave birth to the sustainable food movement, which now is so disseminated that we kind of forget that in the late 50s and 60s, we had completely forgotten how to eat, and industrial food was beginning to spread everywhere. So that interested me. 4 women who had started sweeping social movements. All of them had been outsiders, uncredentialed outsiders. 2 of them, Jane Jacobs and Jane Goodall, hadn't even been to college. So none were ivory tower theorists. They had waded into their various fields, gotten their hands literally and figuratively dirty, and spoken truth to power, and against all odds prevailed. That was interesting too. And then I realized all had been green thinkers. Before green or ecology was part of any of our collective vocabulary. And they had all had their breakthrough moments in the 60s, particularly in the beginning of the 60s. So I thought, this is maybe a book. So I thought my 5th character was probably the 60s. But as I began to read Jane Jacobs and Rachel Carson, and that's where I started, I began to realize that no, my 5th character is really the 1950s. because all of the women, and particularly Carson and Jacobs, were pushing back against the values and priorities of the 50s. Our incredible love affair with technology in the 50s, our increasing disconnection from nature, our deference to big business. Let's just talk about the 50s for a second. And most of us probably were growing up in the 50s. It was an era of Cold War fears and intense conformity. It was the economy was booming, and technology and chemists were king. The great legislative monument of the era was the highway system. Its justification was the speed with which it could move this new class of businessmen in and out of the city to these newly minted suburbs, but also more gravely, should nuclear war break out, the highways were going to be able to move nuclear weapons in and out of cities. So it was a very schizophrenic age. On the one hand, the culture was mesmerized by its own power and wealth, and on the other hand, it was completely paranoid about Armageddon. And I remember, maybe many of us do, nuclear drills. Everyone was terrified that nuclear war might break out. So the bomb had won the war. I should say the other thing that was going on in the 50s was that there was the sense that technology was going to solve every problem. The bomb had won the war, and so chemists and physicists were king. Levitt had taken Henry Ford's idea of mass production and applied it to housing. McDonald's had followed suit with assembly line food, industrial food. The idea about cities was we would knock down huge swaths of the cities to accommodate the highway and the car, which was the sort of new mode of transportation. And there really was the idea that this kind of top-down planning and top-down giant initiatives were the way to solve problems, and that technology would save us, and that nature and natural systems were ours to manipulate, to use, to re-engineer as we pleased. So, you know, I mean, when I think back on that, that all seemed very logical. DDT was developed during the war. It was considered a great panacea. It killed lice for soldiers in the trenches. It killed insects that carried deadly diseases like typhus. There was a typhus outbreak in Naples during the war, and DDT was sprayed over the whole city, and the epidemic was stopped in its tracks. The inventor of DDT got a Nobel Prize, and everyone thought that these kind of chemical manipulations were the way of the future. We would eradicate insect pests with pesticides. We would make farming more efficient with synthetic fertilizers. We would re-engineer animals. We'd feed them various pharmacological things, and it would speed up their growth. And this all seemed to be the way of the future. And everyone believed that, except for a few lone wolves. And these poor women were just those lone wolves who were saying, I don't know, this doesn't look like, they already could see the shadow side of unchecked technology unmoored from human ethics and purpose, and they could already see that the human scale was being lost, and that the quality of the world that we all live in was being compromised socially, the quality as well as physically. So it sort of begs the question, what was it about these women, particularly Carson and Jacobs, that caught people's attention at a time when women, in 1962, there were only 6% of women were doctors because there were very strict quotas on who could go to medical school or law school. There were even fewer lawyers. I think it was only 3% of the population. There were most women could be secretaries. If they were scientists, as Carson was, they could teach, and they could edit science, male scientists' work, but they could really never go into and work in the fields. Women could be secretaries. Jacobs was, as was Goodall. They both went to secretariat school. You could be a stewardess, but as soon as you got married, you had to stop. If you were a woman, there were states where you couldn't be on jury duty because you'd be neglecting your domestic duties. Just insane. A woman couldn't get a credit card without a male co-signer, so you think, what was it about these two women, or these four women, who at a time when women had absolutely no power, that allowed, that really took so that people really listened to what they said. It's very interesting in that at that moment, the culture was given over to expertise and ideology. And architecture at that moment was very much in the modernist canon. It was number-oriented, very theoretical. Decisions were being made about cities based on flow charts and statistics and traffic engineers. Zoology and biology were similarly numbers-oriented. And these women had no theory, had no training, and so they went into the world looking with a very different orientation. What they did was they were keenly observant, and both of them were keenly observant. And because they didn't necessarily know what they were looking for, they looked very, very hard. Let me tell you a little bit about Carson, and then I'll really flesh it out with Jacobs. Carson had, the other thing I should say is also they not only were they keenly observant, but they trusted their intuition, and they really trusted the first-hand experience, being in the world, what they saw and what they felt, and before that, people were only allowed to write in this sort of in an objective way, and they wrote in first person, and their notes and things were based upon what they saw and what they felt and the stories they heard. So Carson grew up in a very, very poor family outside of Pennsylvania. Her father was a complete ne'er-do-well, couldn't hold a job. Her mother tried to cobble things that hold the family together. She gave piano lessons. Her two older kids had dropped out of high school and they were hopeless. And she put sort of all her hope in Rachel. Rachel was a great student and she got a scholarship to college. So she went to college and she thought she wanted to be a writer. She already was sort of gifted and had been published in a couple of children's magazines. And she had to take an entry biology class, as all liberal arts schools. So she got into the class and she fell in love with science, and particularly her professor, a woman named Mary Scott Skinkler, who was just eloquent and dedicated to science. And so halfway through college, she changed her major to biology, to science. So at the end of her four-year schooling, Mary Scott Skinkler got her fellowship at Woods Hole Oceanographic Institute in Massachusetts. Rachel had never seen the sea, but she got to the ocean and she was just completely entranced. And she was still very socially awkward. Because she was so poor, she was a kind of nerdy student. She had, her clothes were all handmade, and so she didn't socialize. And so she walked the beach, and she stared into tide pools, and she sat at the top of dunes. And one of the things she noticed even then was anyone who wrote about science seemed to categorize everything, to make a catalog of what was alive. But there was never any relationship between one thing and the next. And when she looked into tide pools, what she saw was everything was connected, that there were mussels at the floor, and then there were barnacles on the mussels, and then there were little other creatures, that everything was in relationship to everything else. And she began to see that there really was no way to understand what was going on in the ocean without understanding what each creature ate, what ate it, where they lived, and the relationships to each other. She also step by step showed how we too are connected to that food chain. And she would take pond or ocean water back to her studio, and she'd look at it under a microscope, and there were all these microscopic creatures that were feeding the various things she could see. And she also talked about the importance of the unseen, of things that are part of the food chain that we can't see but that sustain the living world. This would become really, really important when she got to writing Silent Spring, which she never actually wanted to do. After college, it was the Depression, she couldn't find any work, and she finally found a 2-day a week job writing these short scripts for the Fish and Wildlife Service. She was supporting her entire family, five members of her family. And so to kind of make ends meet, she started writing freelance articles, and of course they were about the sea. And they were very kind of feel-good, gentle descriptions of the birth of islands and the movement of the tides and how the migration of eels and things like that. So in 1937, she had her first breakthrough. She wrote an essay actually for her boss at the Fish and Wildlife Service, and he said, "I'm sorry, it won't do." And she looked kind of panicked. He said, "It's way too good for a government publication. Send it to the Atlantic." She sent it to the Atlantic, and they took it immediately, and they paid her $100, which was her salary for 2 weeks. And so began her writing career. So she wrote a couple of books. Her second book about the sea became a bestseller. So she was really well known. It was excerpted in the New Yorker, and she became sort of a beloved nature writer. And again, these very gentle books. So in 1958, someone she knew only vaguely wrote her a letter and told her about this big DDT spray campaign. At the time, and you may even remember this from your childhood, I sort of vaguely do, whole towns were being sprayed with DDT to kill insects, to kill mosquitoes, to kill Dutch elm, but also some of the campaigns were 3-state campaigns. So this woman wrote and said, there's going to be a campaign over Massachusetts, Maine, and New Hampshire, and you really should know about it because I think this is a really big story. I think there are lots of people who don't want this sprayed over their property. Rachel had already knew quite a lot about the negative aspects of DDT. While she was working for the Fish and Wildlife Service, she did get promoted and she did get a full-time job eventually. She was editing work by scientists, and she already saw that it was very, very dangerous. That it didn't just kill insects, but it worked its way up the food chain to kill fish and birds and eventually sicken humans. So she wrote to the Reader's Digest and said, I have an idea for a really good story. I'd like to write about, no, I'm sorry, that's out of context. She wrote to the New Yorker because she had written to the Reader's Digest earlier, and they wanted only feel-good stories. So she wrote to E.B. White at the New Yorker and said, I think someone should cover this 3-state spray campaign, and I'm writing to you, you live in Maine, this is going to affect you. And E.B. White wrote back and said, I'm in the middle of a project, but I think you should do it. And she had never written anything polemical, and she didn't consider herself an investigative reporter, and she certainly wasn't a toxicologist, but she thought, well, at the very least, it will be published in the New Yorker, so I'll have some audience, I'll do it. So she started on the book, and she started talking to scientists, and a lot of the information she found was already out there, but it was siloed in these separate fields, and only the experts seemed to know their little slice of the picture. And what Rachel did is she talked to doctors, she talked to entomologists, she talked to people all across the spectrum, and she figured out the whole story, and she wrote it in layman's language, and she kind of knit it together. And one of the things when she was talking to scientists, she heard a story about a spray campaign in University of Wisconsin. And they were looking at the robin population because robins, they were spraying for Dutch elm, and they do it in the fall. Actually, they do it in the spring. And they noticed that a lot of robins died outright. But then they noticed that the next spring there were many, many fewer robins. And what they began to see was that the DDT had landed on the leaves had fallen to the ground, worms had eaten the leaves, and they had taken on a toxic dose of DDT. And then the robins, when they came back in the spring, had eaten the worms and died. Not only did a lot of robins die, but those who didn't die laid eggs, and the eggs didn't hatch, and their ovaries and their testes were filled with the DDT. So Rachel was able to give examples like this and show people that you can't just pour poison in one place and expect it to stay there. Nature doesn't operate in fixed compartments. That if you poison water in one place, it flows into another place. If you spray it in one place, it works its way through the food chain. That essentially all is connected, and that the natural world is a living, complex web of connections and relationships, and that you have to look at the whole system, and you have to protect the whole system. So that's biology. What fascinated me was when I started reading Jane Jacobs, who saved Greenwich Village from the wrecking ball, who saved Washington Square Park from Robert Moses wanted to run a highway through Washington Square Park, and then he wanted to run a superhighway, 8-lane highway along Broome Street. So Jacobs,
along what street?
It was Broome Street. It was going to be Broome Street. So Jacobs, I'll tell you a little bit of background, and then we'll get to this, because this whole idea of connectivity is something that Jacobs also saw. Jacobs didn't go to architecture school, as I said. She talked her way into her first job at Architectural Forum. She basically showed up and said, I want to speak to the editor-in-chief. And she was so charming and so guileless and said, you know, I have no training, but I'm a journalist, and I really am interested in architecture, I want to do this. So the editor said, look, I'll give you a practice article, and if I like it, maybe. So she did the article. It was colorful. It was beautifully written, and he thought, she's great. There's nothing to lose. So he hired her as one of his writers. So one of the first things she was sent to do was to report on an urban renewal project in Philadelphia. At the time, cities were going. The idea was cities were dying. They were going down the tubes, and that the idea was the only way you could save a city was to knock down huge swaths of it, lots of large neighborhoods, and start over again, and put up high-rise housing towers. And Robert Moses was a proponent of this, as was the urban planner in Philadelphia named Ed Bacon. And people really believed that so many people had fled to the suburbs that you really needed to thin out the city. So Jacobs had no real feeling about urban renewal. It was a completely new idea. It was federally funded. So she took the train to Philadelphia. And she was met by Ed Bacon, who said, first I'm going to show you the neighborhood, the kind of neighborhood we're going to get rid of. And then I'll show you what we're doing. So they walked to this very busy neighborhood, a residential neighborhood, and Jacobs saw all these people on the street, chatting, popping in and out of stores, children, old people. It was very, very lively and very crowded. And he said, this is so chaotic. So then he brought her, he said, all right, now we'll walk a couple blocks and we'll get to our project. So they walked a few blocks and they got to the project, and Jacobs, they were across the street, and she looked across, and there were these four monolithic, faceless housing towers, and sort of grass sort of dead around it, and no one in sight. And Jacob said, where are the people? And he said, oh, they don't appreciate the symmetry, the order, it's so tidy. And she thought to herself, something about this isn't working. The human quotient has been lost. And so riding back on the train, she thought about it a lot. When she got to Architectural Forum, she said, this idea of urban renewal, I've just seen it, and it's not working as they believe it is, and I'm going to write that. And all her fellow writers and editors said, you can't do that. People like Robert Moses are saving the cities. And she said, I have to write what I just saw, which is that it's so dehumanizing. So she wrote the article, and there was just a groundswell of excitement over what she'd said. It was as if she'd said the emperor has no clothes. And this led to another article, an even bigger article in Fortune magazine, which garnered more letters of interest than the magazine had ever gotten. And that led to a book contract. And so the book contract was to write about what makes the city work. Now Jacobs, because she had no training and no theory, thought the only way I'm going to figure this out is I'm going to walk every block of the city, and I'm going to walk other cities. So she started walking through New York and trying to figure out what made a block, why some blocks were lively and others were sort of felt menacing, why parks, some were scabby with disuse, others were filled with people, what the role of the sidewalk was, what the role of the street. And everywhere she went, she watched very carefully, looking for patterns. and she talked to people. And one day she was in Harlem, and there was a big group of people crowded around two TVs they'd hot-wired from electric pole, and there were men drinking beer and kids running around, and it was very, very lively, and she had an epiphany. And the epiphany was, it wasn't just the way buildings looked, or a neighborhood looked. There was a human ecology. It was the street life. The street life was what made a city come alive and what kept it safe. And that if you knocked down whole swaths of the city, you knocked out the street life. And it was the streets that connected, that allowed one neighborhood to flow into the next and kind of connected the whole urban grid. And that without that, the city went dead. That cities were intricate webs of people. They were about relationships and interconnections, just like what Rachel had seen in the natural world. And this is exactly at the same time. We're writing at the same time. So Jacobs realized, I mean, at the time everything was being studied in each thing in isolation. And what she was saying is you can't possibly understand a city or a neighborhood without understanding all the factors that connect all the people and the kinds of things that connect the city. And that the denser the better, because the more people in the street, more people at different times. You go to a neighborhood now like Soho, which is kind of a monoculture. It's only designer stores. At night, it's completely dead, because whereas in the village, there's still all kinds of other things that go on. So this idea of understanding the interconnections between living things and the idea that you can't really study anything in isolation and that you need to understand the larger systems really meant these women were systems thinkers. They were looking at the systems that sustained the living world, whether it was urban or rural. And Jacobs was saying that the city worked by the same environmental principles that the natural world did. And that, for instance, something like diversity, she likened a really busy, dense neighborhood to a fertile wetlands, which is just where all kinds of new life is nurtured, a nursery for new life. And she saw a neighborhood like her own in the village as a place that was a nursery for new jobs and for people who meet each other and be able to come up with new ideas. She also said, you think about a place like Grand Central. It's filled with people during rush hour, and everyone's moving, toward each other, yet no one bumps into each other. It's a kind of swarm logic. It's a kind of organized complexity. It's like a school of fish or a swarm of bees or birds. There's a kind of pattern. There's an organization that we don't necessarily call, there's no central, there's no one leading it, but it's there. And she said that this kind of swarm logic operated in cities just as it does in the natural world. She also said cities, like the natural world, were perpetually evolving. They were never finished. And the idea of top-down interventions was artificial, and that because it almost presumed that it was done. And when you look at a neighborhood like Soho, which was small manufacturing, it was abandoned, and then it was reconstituted as artist lofts, and then designer stores and theaters and dance studios. And Jacob said you have to allow for that in the city. You have to know that these things, that cities evolve and they're constantly changing, and you have to leave enough room for these things to happen. And if you try to control everything by kind of top-down interventions, you break up the natural feedback loop. The other, I won't go into because we'll probably run out of time, but the other two women also discovered the same idea of connectivity. Maybe I should just quickly say a little about Jane Goodall. At the time Jane Goodall was sent to Gombe, she was very pretty. She'd waitressed in order to get enough money to get to Kenya. And she really wanted to work with wild animals. That's what she told her family. When she got to Kenya, she was told that if she really wanted to be around animals, she should go talk to Louis Leakey, who's head of the museum there, the Natural History Museum. Louis Leakey was a skirt chaser, and he took one look at beautiful Jane and thought, she's terrific. And so he hired her. She went and talked to him at the museum, called him up cold, and 2 hours later she was hired as secretary. And so that summer she went with him on one of his digs with his wife, and he was already an eminent archaeologist, and he very much wanted to do a study of chimps in the wild because he believed that if someone could find behaviors in chimpanzees that were similar to humans, that would be that would explain something of our ancestry. So he had always looked for a male researcher, and he hadn't succeeded. And that summer he noticed about Jane that she was incredibly focused and quiet and concentrated, and he thought, maybe sending a woman would be better, it'd be less threatening to male chimpanzees. So he raised the money even though she had no training, and a year later she was sent to this game preserve where living in a tent. Now she didn't know what she was looking for at all, and she knew that the funds were going to run out in 6 months. So, and at the time, the way animals were perceived as they were operated only by instinct, that was the idea. They were biological monoliths. They were almost like clocks that operated by fixed laws. And there was no sense that no one believed they had sentience or intent or could plan or have emotions. And she took a long time before she could even see them. They were habituated to her presence. But once, after about 3 months, they got used to her enough so that she could sit there and watch. And in order to remember who they were, she started writing down what they looked like and giving them names, which was really verboten in the scientific world. And she began to see, as she identified them, that there were all kinds of relationships. There were friendships, there were feuds, there was jealousy, there was tenderness, there was incredible nurturing. And she began to realize that they were all connected, that there were relationships. And the other women were also looking at the world they were mapping relationships, and so was Jane. She began to see that these chimpanzees were not biological monoliths. They had a whole constellation of emotions as complex as ours, and that they were very intricately connected, and that in order to understand anything about their behavior, you had to look at the whole group. Again, the same idea of the larger system and the connectivity between individuals. The men who had made the 50s saw the world as in terms of hierarchies and separations, and these women were looking at the world holistically. They were looking at the relationships that made the entire web, which is a paradigm shift, and a really significant one. We've so internalized that now that things like holistic medicine we take for granted, that we study the whole body. But this was very, very new and very threatening, which is hard to believe. Alice Waters, the same thing. How are we doing on time? Yeah. So we should say you want to hear a little about Alice?
Yeah.
Okay. So Alice, again, she didn't go to cooking school. She learned to cook by watching Julia Child on TV and working her way through Julia Child's cookbooks. And but she remembered the food she had had in France, and she remembered it was really, really tasty. So when she started her restaurant, her first idea was, I'm just going to make a clubhouse for my friends. We're going to have a great place to hang out and drink wine and eat good food. And as she started to cook, it never tasted the way she remembered the same recipes, the things that she'd had in France. And industrial agriculture was in full thrall at that point. And when she went to the supermarket, all the vegetables looked great, but they had no taste. And she began to realize she needed to figure out where she could get better produce and better. So she started going to Chinatown and other kind of ethnic markets, and people started showing up at the back door of Chez Panisse with vegetables and things they'd grown in their backyards in Berkeley. And Berkeley, people were already interested in organic food, and it was beginnings of that, and so she would cook with those, and they were so much more tasty, and things turned out so much better. And when I interviewed her, she said, you know, at the time, in the early 70s, I didn't, you know, the organic groceries and things, I didn't like those places. All the food always looked dry and kind of oversized, and they smelled medicinal, and the bread was heavy, but they didn't really know how to do it yet. But these things that friends would bring really were good. And she began to see there was a connection between the health of the soil and the way things tasted. And that if you cared for the soil and cared for what you were growing, it was not only more healthy for all of us, but it was more healthy for the environment. So she began to see those kind of larger connections between what she was trying to do and the systems that support them. And then now what she does is she started school gardens in grade schools all over the country. She started in Berkeley, but she's been trying to pass this, trying to teach kids the cycle from seed to table and compost and back to seed, and then that they have to care about if we're going to save the planet, we have to, and eat well, we have to save the soil and save the farmers and keep the water from being polluted with pesticides. So, again, same connectivity. The thing that is interesting about all four women is they had a very different timeline. At the time, corporate America was always looking short-term solutions, growth for the next quarter, very narrowly focused. And these women were looking at what's sustainable in the long term. So they were looking for solutions that came from the bottom up, that were organic, and that were local, and that applied to where they were, rather than this kind of top-down mentality. They also understood that people will only protect what they love. And so they didn't write in jargon, they didn't write in dry scientific language. They wrote in everyday language with lots of stories. And when you read Jane Jacobs' The Death and Life of Great Americans, it's a great book. And no one would say a book about urban planning, you know, it's going to be a page turner, but it is. It's filled with humor and stories. And the same with Rachel Carson's book. It's only 200 pages. It's an analysis of 19 deadly pesticides, but she writes it with such lyricism and with such appreciation for the natural world that it's really beautiful. And so they understood that you have to reach people where they are, and that people will protect what they care about. They also saw that these were really big philosophical questions that were facing the country. Were we going to industrialize nature completely, or were we going to pull back and think about trying to harmonize and study natural systems and work with them? And so they put a human face on very complicated questions. And they said, you can understand this. It's not just the experts. It's all of us. We're not experts, and this is what we see. Which was very, very smart. And so they reached huge readership. Rachel Carson's Silent Spring was a bestseller for 2 years straight. It was on the bestseller list. So their arguments were accessible, and they really believed that the world is comprised of natural systems, and that we need to, rather than trying to re-engineer them, we have to work with them, which was way ahead of their time. I always like to end with, some people have read the book, which I loved, because I have some stories that didn't make it into the book, so, I want you to fire away with questions. I'll tell you a few. But I like to end with the poet-farmer Wendell Berry wrote that the world is divided into nurturers and exploiters. And this is what he said. So he said, the standard of the exploiter is efficiency. The standard of the nurturer is care. The exploiter's goal is money, profit. The nurturer's goal is health of her land, her family, her community, her country. The exploiter typically serves an institution. The nurturer serves land, household, community, place. The exploiter thinks in terms of numbers, quantities, hard facts. The nurturer in terms of character, quality, kind. Rachel Carson and Jane Jacobs and Alice Waters and Jane Goodall all were nurturers. And it's not necessarily a female quality, but we all need to be nurturers in the natural world. Okay, so. I will tell one story if you want, about Jane Jacobs that I heard from her son after the fact. I went up to Canada and I talked to him. He told me an amazing story, which is so typical of Jane. Robert Moses wanted to run a highway along Groom Street. It was going to be 10-lane or 8-lane. It was going to be on. It was raised, and so it would have wiped out what is now Soho, all those incredible cast iron buildings. And you know, we all know what it's like to be anywhere near those stanchions from big highways. You don't want to get anywhere near. They're filled with garbage. They're smelly. There's bums living there. So when Jacobs was helping organize the fight against this highway, which was going to go, also was going to wipe out Little Italy, Chinatown, parts of the Valley, this is unthinkable. She noticed that there were always a lot of guys in hard hats, and they were mafia guys who did cement. So she remembered that she'd had a school friend from Pennsylvania whose father was in the mafia. And Jane, being very pragmatic, thought, I wonder if my friend could arrange a meeting with Joey Bonanno, who was the head of the mafia founders. So sure enough, her friend, who she was still quite close to, his father, was able to organize a meeting for Jane and her friend to go to Joe Bonanno. And his office was in Little Italy, and they came with their pocketbooks and their white gloves, and they sat down, and Jane explained that that this highway was going to disrupt all these neighborhoods, and that his guys could build a highway, put concrete, many places in the city, but why do it right through Little Italy, their own neighborhood? And he listened. He didn't say anything. He just nodded his head, and she talked it all through with him for about an hour. And when she left, he said, "I'll think about it." And never again did any of those guys show up at the meetings for loneliness. And they just dropped away. So she'd been successful, which is, again, so smart of her, that she understood that things happen because of relationships, and that it may be distasteful, but if you can talk to people, and if you can talk to the right people who can pull a lever, you might just win. And so she was so savvy about talking to everyone, even people on the other side of the aisle, and appealing to them in a very personal way. Which I love that story only because it's just so policy. Which she was. I mean, she's the only one who faced down Robert Moses and succeeded. It's just it's unbelievable. So anyone who read the book want to ask a question? Yeah?
I'm just a little curious, and please don't take this the wrong way, but if this was a book about four men, you delved a little bit into, especially those who weren't married, their personal lives, their sex lives, and I was kind of a little uncomfortable with that, because I thought it sort of, I understand you wanted to humanize it, but I also thought it took away a little bit, because I felt like their accomplishments should have stood without that.
You mean Rachel?
Rachel, and even with Alice, it seemed like the ones who were sort of outside the norms, if you will.
I wanted it to be a group biography. And I wanted it to be a biography insofar as I wanted to dramatize the moments of observation, their epiphanies, and I wanted them to be flesh and blood. And I have to say that Alice, there's just one paragraph that I said to my editor, I don't know whether I want that in, because it's this moment where she doesn't look very good in her marriage. And my editor said, no, I think you should keep it in. It shows how driven she was, and that was important for people to know. And I worried about that. But the others, I feel as if, Rachel Carson, I feel as if it was very light touch. Rachel had a woman friend who I think was the love of her, well, I know she was the love of her life, but it was probably, it might have been platonic, it might have been carnal, but I never got into that because that seemed to be, wasn't what the book was about. But I really tried to I think if I was writing about men, I would have told something of their story, because otherwise they wouldn't really seem they had lives, you know, and especially Jacobs. Jacobs had a family life. She was a great mother. She was really close to her husband, who was part of every fight. And I sort of felt that made them real. And it wasn't just, I mean, I'm someone who remembers ideas through stories. So it's really a lot of stories about those women. Anyway, that's what I felt. It's not a, you know, it's not a textbook. It's really a book about 4 women who sort of, you know, stood up to power and somehow succeeded, and for that reason changed things. But I actually, it's funny you say that, because I took a lot of heat from feminists who said, well, you didn't talk about whether Rachel Carson had a carnal relationship. And I thought, no, it's not the purview of this book to talk about that. Yeah.
What do you think about the sort of controversy with the chef Jeremiah Tower, who worked with Alice Waters and who was highly trained,
Yeah.
and is thought to be the father of Nouvelle cuisine?
And there's a lot about him that he claims it was him, but
Well, Anthony Bourdain also, when they did a documentary about him.
Yeah, but the thing was, what was Alice's contribution was the clean, local, organic salad. I mean, Jeremiah Tower did these incredible French dishes that were very complicated, a lot of them traditional, and did them well, but they were very elaborate. What Alice was interested in is the simple essence of the flavors and the freshness of the food, and she was the one who wanted not only local ingredients, but chemically free. That wasn't his innovation, and they kind of parted ways at a certain point because lots of people had stopped coming to Chez Panisse because it was getting fancier and fancier. And he is a brilliant chef, but that wasn't really what she was after. She wanted simple food that could be found, that you found in rural France, that in a little cafe where it was all fresh and local and had terroir, you know, the flavor of the place. So that was really her contribution. His was something else. And he did have a lot to do with getting Chez Panisse on the map. But when they parted ways, I mean, now when I ate there, one of the things that struck me was it's not really remarkable because there are now so many great farm-to-table restaurants that we're used to a really beautiful salad that really has great taste, and a simple tomato, just a little drizzled olive oil. That kind of thing is we've come to expect that from a good restaurant, which that had been lost in America. You know, in the 50s, with convenience foods, that was, you know, things like tomatoes look great and they had no taste. And that's her real contribution is that. And also her contribution is the school gardens. And that he's a kind of superstar. He's a Wolfgang Puck kind of guy. But they did have, I mean, initially she was completely seduced by his beautiful cooking, and they were great collaborators in the beginning, but then they did part ways because they had, philosophically, they were very different. I think he was quite bitter about her first cookbook. He felt didn't give him enough credit, and that's true. Anyone else? Yes?
Did you have other ideas, other visionary women?
Well, there's one. Betty Friedan wrote Feminine Mystique in '63, which also started the sweeping social movement, and is exactly the same time, and it was really an audacious book. However, all 4 of my women were preservationists. They were trying to preserve endangered systems, endangered cities, and she was trying to blow up a system that was profoundly unfair to women. So she wasn't a green thinker. So that's why she wasn't there. But people often ask me, who are the visionaries now? And that's a really tricky question because all of these women, because they were outsiders, they saw the world in a very fresh way. And sometimes I think you have to be outside the status quo. Maybe most of the time you have to be out of the status quo to see things in a new way. So I suspect that some of the visionaries we don't know yet because they're working away. There's one woman named Janine Venice who's very involved in something called biomimicry, which is quite interesting. And what she's doing is she's got a convocation of engineers and scientists and designers, and she feels that if we study natural systems and patterns, that all kinds of solutions to our technological world can be found. And a good example is Velcro. Has those little hooks, and it's just like burdock. And if you look at the way burdock sticks to a dog's fur or any clothes. So she feels that one of the reasons we need to preserve the world, the natural world, is that the solutions to all of our issues are there, which is very interesting. So I would say she's probably a visionary of a different generation. Yeah, I mean, I would have loved to have had a woman of color, but in 1962, even being a woman was pretty unusual to be listened to at all. And they just happened to be wonderful writers. And that was, and also magazines. It's interesting you said about magazines because the power, all of them got their start by writing articles in magazines, and now the general interest magazines have all but disappeared. I mean, it was the Atlantic and the New Yorker, and Jane was in National Geographic. Most households got all of those magazines, and now, we look at things online and we just sort of skim over things, and so there was a collective culture that they were able to kind of tap into. And books were almost subversive. I mean, their books were like secret handshakes. Books were almost like bombs. They really did change the world. It's very rare now that a book will do what Jane Jacobs, what The Death and Life of Great American Cities did, or Silent Spring. Yeah?
Yeah.
Oh,
I haven't read the book.
Yeah?
But my curiosity is about visionary women and motherhood.
Well, do you want to know about these?
Yes.
Yeah. Well,
I know Jane Goodall had a child.
One thing really interesting is all of them had incredibly nurturing mothers who themselves who believed that they could be captains of industry, that they could do anything. And that was also unusual. I mean, that when Jane Goodall said she wanted to go and live with wild animals in Africa, her mother and grandmother said, "We're behind you," They were really, really nurturing. They also had, two of them had absent fathers. So they lived in female households. Jane Goodall lived with two female aunts and a sister and her mother and her grandmother. This is all women. They wrote plays and put them on, and so it was a very female, Jane Jacobs had a very happy family, 2 brothers and 2 sisters, and mother and father who she was close to. But her mother also, she wrote to every day. There are letters in her archives. Every day she writes a newsletter. And Rachel Carson completely, the reason she's a writer is her mother made every sacrifice in order for that to happen. Her father died young, but also was a complete ne'er-do-well. And Alice Waters had her father was conservative and Republican, and her mother was very liberal and also very encouraging. Rachel Carson really never had, whether she was a lesbian or whether she never had the time to have a relationship is unclear. She was supporting her family. She was so busy between her work and then she did all her writing at night. She'd start at 10 at night and write till she fell in her chair. So she never had any time for relationships, whether that was by choice or just circumstance. When Jane Goodall had, it's funny you said about too much personal life, because the first draft of Jane Goodall, I had 15 pages of Jane's lovers, and I thought, this is a little unbalanced. So they came out. She had lots of lovers and two marriages, but I don't really actually get into that marriage much. Who have I left out? Well, Alice. Alice had one marriage. But they trying to think. Jane Goodall had a child, Alice had a child, Jane Jacobs had 3 children, and Rachel Carson had actually a grandniece that a great nephew that she raised. I should also say, for those who don't know anything about Carson's life, while she was writing Silent Spring, she was dying of cancer. She'd had a radical mastectomy. She didn't want it, and it had metastasized, but she didn't want to tell anyone because she was afraid that the chemical companies would say, well, the only reason this woman is talking about the correlation between pesticides and cancer is that she's dying of cancer. So she kept it secret. So it was really lonely, and she was pushing. When she testified before the Congress, she hobbled. She had fractures in her spine from the radiation. She was wearing a wig because she was bald. She was just really at death's door, and out of that testimony came eventually the EPA, but she never lived to see it because she died 8 months later. But so it was a very lonely last. Her story is very tragic and very courageous. I mean, because we wouldn't. DDT was banned, I think a few years later, but it was banned from the United States earlier. But she really started, sweeping the whole environmental movement. Really started with that, and if she hadn't done it, the other tragic thing is she'd already noticed that seas were warming up, and that and they were rising, and she was very concerned about that. And at that time, the environment wasn't partisan. It wasn't, Nixon was Republican, and the EPA was started under him. And one wonders if she'd lived, because she was 56 when she died, if she'd lived, her next book might have been about the rising seas and the warming seas, and how she'd already noticed that certain shellfish were not surviving where they had in Cape Cod. It might have been a whole different picture, which is just tragic, because she had the ear of the whole world, not just the United States, but her book was a bestseller all over the world. So her next one would have had a real audience. So that's sad.
Do you have any insight, having written this book, why that envelope of time was when these women encouraged their daughters to be what they could be?
Boy, that's a really good question. I think it was an aberration, actually, that they were encouraged. I don't know. I mean, the culture was changing. By the beginning of the 60s, the culture was beginning to change, but these women were raised before that. I think it was just kind of nurturing instinct, and it was, I don't know about the patterns. One of the things I didn't say, and that when I was writing this book, I read, Jacob said, I don't really know what I think. Most of us begin with confirmation bias. We think we know what we think, we go into the world and we collect data that supports our opinion. She said, I go out into the world and I look really carefully, and when I start to see patterns, and I start to see them in various realms, then I generalize, then I think I know what I think. And I tried to do that when I was writing the book. I didn't start understanding that these women were systems thinkers, and that they were really looking at the connectivity of the whole web of life. But I began to see those patterns, and I didn't see any pattern about the mothers that would have indicated why. There was, in the 20s, there was something, a nature study movement, and there was reverence for nature, which Rachel Carson's mother sort of felt the highest thing she could do was to impress upon her daughter how important nature was. But that doesn't really answer why she was such a nurturing mother. I mean, she would type, she lived with Rachel her whole life until she died. And when Rachel was writing, she'd write till 2 a.m., and then she'd leave the handwritten paper, and her mother the next morning would type everything up. And when she came back from work, the clean pages were there. So she was, and Rachel read aloud every draft to her mother, and her mother, listened. So she was really, really there. And also she did all the cooking and the grocery shopping, so poor Rachel could do her work. So it took that.
Relationships.
Yeah.
I was wondering if you have the same, let's say, interest in the four of them, or if one of them was more special, or one more slippery and
Well, Jane Jacobs is my favorite because she was such a hero, and she was so fearless and funny. But one of the things is the first three women are gods, and Alice Waters is my generation is a little bit more flawed, a little bit more mortal. I loved her when I met her, but she isn't as much of a complete saint as the other three. So, but I like her. I really like her a lot, and I like her story. But as you said, there's a few warts in her story. But I did Jane Jacobs just because she had no training, and she absolutely changed architecture, and it's 60 years later, and there's no architecture student who doesn't read her book. And it was all just gut instinct. She just was so smart and read so avidly, and there was just, I really admired, and also she was so selfless. None of them, I should say, except for Alice Waters, had egos. They were really following their passions. They had no power, so they had nothing to lose. But they also were not interested in stardom or, in fact, Rachel Carson was mortified that people were always asking her to come and speak. And Jane Jacobs also didn't like it when people said, "Oh, will you sign my book?" What she wanted is for people to read her books and for her to just work. And so I loved that too, that they were so egoless. So I often ask people who read the book who they liked the most. But it's different. My husband liked Alice Waters because he's a cook, and he loved it. Because Alice was so determined to get it right.
Well, there's an opportunity still to ask another question privately or individually, and we have a small reception over here with some wine and pretzels if you want them. So, and books, and there are books. So,
and I should say also the drawings on the cover are my daughter's best friend in childhood became an illustrator, and so I love the fact she did the drawings. She did them, and then my publisher sent me some drawings, and I said, "Oh no, let's use these," and they said, "Okay." So I like that too.
Well, there are books there, but you can take the book down to the store in the entrance, pay for it, and come back and get the obviously.
Welcome. Hi. I know we have some readers here in the audience, and there's some people who are new to the museum tonight. First time, great, welcome. I'm not sure exactly where you heard about us, but please tell me later so I know. But I can tell you we're readers because I'm Carol Willis. I'm the founder, director, and curator of the museum. I love to watch the people who encounter the exhibitions for the first time, and there were at least 5 of you standing over there and hadn't gotten any farther than like the first 3 columns of the entry wall narrative. So those are the people I call the readers. And the others just kind of come in and start look around and walk out quickly. So welcome readers tonight to one of our book talks. So if you have not been here before, we do a monthly authors talk series, which is usually about a book about New York history or urbanism or skyscrapers, of course, worldwide, or our favorites when it's about New York, and a series of other talks. So I know some of you are members, so if you were a member, you would have been invited for tomorrow night for the opening of this exhibition. We're in the last stages. Well, I'd like to think it's the last stages, but there are still quite a few items on the punch list still to be finished of this exhibition on the history of housing in New York, called Housing Density, and the issues about what is density historically and how did it develop in New York, and also with the implication about, well, how do we think about it for the future. And with the subject of density, the topic, the focus visionary woman of tonight that Andrea Barnet is going to talk about is Jane Jacobs, as well as a little bit about the others, and the three others that are part of this book is a four-woman focus on visionary. Because Jane Jacobs figures in this exhibition because she was a critic of most of the housing that you see on the walls here, and she was an advocate or a kind of urbanism that she described so eloquently in her West Village neighborhood that's often called human scale, kind of low scale, but was really about the kind of participatory social life of the street in the city. And in a chapter that that is, I think, little appreciated in her great book, The Death and Life of Great American Cities from 1961, she wrote in chapter 11 about the need for concentration. And she was calling for density. In fact, she was calling for a density which was on a level that was, as we show in the exhibition, 3 times as dense as the urban renewal projects that she was criticizing at the time. So as an advocate for cities and for density, she was a visionary who predicted, not in her moment, but for today, one of the kind of persistent themes of what has become this century, right? She wrote the book in the 1960s, but in the 21st century, there is no woman in urban planning, and the history of urban planning or preservation planning today, urban planning today, there is no more important figure than Jane Jacobs, even though at the time she was coming, as Andrea will, I'm sure, describe to us, out of an unlikely context in order to articulate this idea about the biggest topic really there is. And she took New York as her subject in order to do, in modern terms, kind of deconstruct and unpack what are these characteristics, which she described from her empirical experiences of the city. And so speaking of empirical, Andrea is, I see she calls herself on her website, and other people who write extraordinary blurbs about this book, Walter Isaacson and Bill McKibben and a whole host of, Kurt Anderson and a whole host of other people who praised her writing. But calling herself a journalist, as Jane Jacobs, I think, would have too, coming out of writing for periodicals and professional magazines, someone who looks with a kind of cold eye, analytical eye, but also a predilection for the interesting story, for the kind of eloquent phrase. So I have to confess that I have been all day trying to be a visionary woman instead of reading about visionary women. I look forward to doing that at some point in the future, as soon as this show is finished. But in any case, I'm delighted for you to welcome, as well as me, Andrea Barnet, who is also the author, I'll mention her other book, of the All Night Party, which is about Bohemian women in Greenwich Village and Harlem, and especially in the 1910s and 20s. You know, what a delightful topic. We were just talking about that. So anyway, here's Andrea.